Okay. Evening, everybody. Hope everything is going as well as it can be. We're living some, for lack of better terms, some very interesting times. So I will not pontificate or editorialize because we want to talk about history and we're living in it right now, obviously. But we're going to continue. Tonight will be the last class on the Rama. This will be the third one, it'll be the last one. And when I finish talking about him, the Vaad Arba Ah'Aratzot, the Council of the Four Lands, a little bit more about the Rama and about what he wrote and did, we'll stop. Whether it's the end of the class, not the end of the class, because I don't want to continue beyond the Rama tonight. Mentioned last week that because the Rama, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, wrote the words "V'chein anu nohagim" or "anu nohagim," which means our custom is, or we are accustomed to, when he edited the Shulchan Aruch on the words of Rabbi Yosef Karo. I may give a separate shiur next week, possibly on minhagim. I have one. It's a little bit, how to put it, it's like yeshivish almost. It means like it has lots of sources and all. So I'll probably edit it down to make it, not that you couldn't understand it, just that's not the style for this particular kind of class. So, but I want to talk about customs, I think, next week, and I'll open it up to anybody who wants to join besides this, the Jewish history class. So where we left off, I gave some background and history to the Vaad Arba Ah'Aratzot, also known in English as the Council of the Four Lands, Lesser Poland, Greater Poland, Bohemia, and escapes me the fourth one, which makes up a large area of modern day Poland and beyond. And what I said I was going to pick up tonight, I was going to talk about a couple little vignettes or stories of things that came out of the Vaad Arba Ah'Aratzot, and we're also going to talk about some of their actual takanot, some of their things that they enacted, and for what reasons, and what the results were from each one. So they actually faced some, during their time period, remember, they were over a period of about 400 years. They faced some specific problems, some specific challenges, I guess you could say. One was economic pressure. And the economic pressure came because the population, the Jewish population, was growing very rapidly, creating competition, creating economic problems. And part of the job of the, hold on. Here. Part of the job, self-imposed job of the Council of the Foreign Lands was to try to balance the interests of the people that were under their guidance, or whatever the proper word is, between the wealthy merchants and the poor stam people on the street. And that was part of their job. So there were some other challenges, which I think would be self-evident, but I mentioned them anyways. And that had to do, and we mentioned it briefly already last, maybe 2 weeks ago, anti-Jewish sentiment. I know it's hard to imagine a world where people hate you just because you're Jew. Interestingly enough, as we speak right now, unless it's finished, Elise Stefanik is in front of a congressional hearing for her becoming the ambassador to the UN for the United States. We talk about a champion of protecting Jews. She is the top of the list. She's an amazing woman. But we didn't have an Elise Stefanik back then in the Middle Ages of Poland. And so that was part of the problem. And there were anti-Jewish sentiments among the Polish nobility, among the clergy, and the part of the job that the council had was to defend Jews for what was their rights, their various rights. Remember, this didn't just pop up. Remember, we talk about the background already. The Jews were given permission. There was an edict and permissions given for them to become part of the community, of the society, and they were supposed to. They were helping out in all kinds of ways economically, and of course, the flip side is that you get hated for that too. The other challenge they faced, and we'll talk about actions they took soon, but among the other challenges they faced had to do with that in the 1760s. And just putting that into perspective, just a few years later is the American Revolution, 1776. The Polish government under economic reformers, meaning people within the Polish government, they decided we're done. This isn't going to continue, and they abolished the Council of the Four Lands. And as a result, the people themselves, and of course the council that's now been dissolved, saw this as a big step backwards in trying to integrate Jews into regular society, broader economic society, and also they've lost their ability, the council lost their ability to be involved in helping, to the best of their abilities, in all the needs of these various countries. But they did leave a very strong legacy. Again, before we get into some of their takanot, just to kind of like summarize this part, they did leave a very strong legacy. It demonstrated the capacity of Jews to self-govern. Now, parentheses for a second, that idea was taken in a very nefarious way in some of the concentration camps, where they have the Judenrat, the Jewish council that was responsible for doing a lot of bad things, which we'll talk about eventually. But what is still left to this very day, and there's actually a series of books, especially here in the National Library, special books of records. They're called the Pinkasim or Pinkasa. Pinkasa is like a little notebook. But over the centuries, the word meant something a little bit more than just a little notebook. Most communities, let's say in Poland, most of the shtetl had a pinkas that had the information about the community and the people and the machers of the community and births and deaths. But there were pinkasim or records kept by the Vaad Arba Ah'Aratzot of their takanot, their enactments, their court rulings, and it gave not me, but people who really were into this, an invaluable view into Jewish life at that time of history. Social life, economic life, religious life of Eastern European Jewry. But again, it became somewhat of a model of future governance or self-governance of Jews by Jews. But I do want to talk about four takanot, or four enactments that they made, and talk about what they were, what their purpose was. The first one was a regulation of tax burden distribution. Interestingly enough, remember, they just said that this is abolished in 1760. Just a few years later, you have this whole idea of taxation by representation, the whole issue in the United States, the colonies, the original 13 colonies, that British were taking taxes from the colonies, but weren't putting it into the colonies. They're using it in England, which led to the Boston Tea Party and all kinds of other wonderful American history things. But their goal for the takana they were about to make, and I'll tell you what is the second, was to ensure that the communities would be equitably taxed. It would not be a financial burden that is imposed by the Polish government would hurt or would infringe more on one part of a society than another. So the goal was to distribute that financial burden of taxes by the Polish government, and they were assessed based on population size and economic capacity. A wealthier community had to contribute more. Now, remember, you said, like, so who, the expression, who died made you the big cheese. But these communities accepted on themselves the enactments, the statements, the legal decisions of the Vaad Arba Ah'Aratzot. So for them, this was law. Maybe it's a lowercase l, but it was the law. What was the impact of this? So let's say, for example, I'm making this up, obviously, because I don't know. Let's say you had one part of a country where of the Polish government that was under their auspices, that you had amazingly wealthy people, and in that same community you had some very poor people, and the wealthy people are in a position that they can carry the whole burden, but the wealthy people demanded, no, everyone has to share equally. Why should we have, just because we're multi-millionaires of zloty or whatever it was, why should we have to bear the burden? So, and it meant that let's say, again, making up numbers, you have 1,000 zloty from one family who's a multi-gazillionaire versus 1,000 zloty from poor Mendele, the shepherd, is going to be a big difference. So they made the takana that everyone had to share the burden equally. And therefore, If they couldn't share it equally, the wealthier of the community would have to share a greater part. There was no, it's on the poor, it's only on the wealthy. There was some modicum of equality, of equity. The difference between equity and equality. Equality means it's equal. Everyone gave the exact same amount. Equity means fair. I'll tell you an interesting side point. I heard many years ago from a speaker. She was a woman who was speaking to a group in Chicago and was talking about marriage. And that's I say these two words. It's the first thing I think about this particular speech because it made an impact on me. And I've used her words many times in talking to couples. Said that she made what sounded like a very negative statement at the opening of her comments. It was, there's no such thing as equality in marriage. It's like everyone's like, what? Of course there's equality in marriage. She says no, but there has to be equity, and she had to explain. Equality means that the husband does the dishes half the time, the wife does the dishes half the time. The husband does the cleaning half the time, the wife does the cleaning half the time. That's equality. Everyone has the equal burden, in quotes. Equity means that they share in the responsibilities in an equitable fashion so that one does not have an overabundance of the amount of work that has to be done, and the other one is the husband, just joking. It's not fair. So here again, there had to be a sense of equity, but it would not be equality. What was the impact? What was the impact of this takana? I think that it's self-evident, and that is it minimized internal conflicts over financial responsibilities. No longer could the poor point to the rich or the rich point to the poor and say, it's your responsibility, it's your job, it's it, whatever it is. They all were governed by, and they all agreed that when the takanot would come out, when it came to financial responsibilities, they would live by it. It also helped their bargaining position between the Jewish community and the Polish government or Polish authorities. The next topic they made a takana about is a topic that is in today's world extremely misconstrued in a terrible way. So first, let me tell you about the history part of this time, and then we'll talk about nowadays. There's something in Hebrew called misirah. In anglicized Hebrew, it's mesira, which literally means to hand over. There was the prohibition of the Vaad Arba Ah'Aratzot against a Jew informing on a fellow Jew to the authorities that he had done something bad. Its purpose, and I'll explain with the context in a minute, the purpose was to protect the Jewish communities from external threats or internal betrayal. What does that mean? The external threat would be Joe Schmo turns in his neighbor. He didn't like him. So he contacts the Polish authorities and say that this man tried to poison the Polish wells or whatever it was claimed. And he was being handed over to a government that was not necessarily the most righteous of governments. Internal betrayal was the idea that it was used as blackmail. You don't do this for me, then I'm going to report you to the government. Doesn't make a difference. I can make all kinds of stories up. That was the purpose, to protect the community. What was misira? What did that mean? I guess the right word in English in past tense is forbade. I don't know if I've ever said that in my whole life, but it forbade individuals from informing non-Jewish authorities about internal affairs or disputes in the Jewish community, because the problem could be the misuse of that information. It could lead to persecution, prosecution. It can increase taxes, legal penalties against Jews, all kinds of problems. And of course, what the impact was, it helped to solidify the community and keep it much stronger with little to no interference from outside the Jewish community. Now, before we go on to the next couple of takanot, we have to talk about this topic because it's something that is very near and dear to my heart. What sounds like from this is if you live in, let's say you live in the United States, and you are standing outside at night and you see your neighbor break into another person's house and steal money. You shouldn't call the police because that's mesira. You're handing them over. You're handing them over to the authorities. And that's not true. It's not mesira, because mesira applies when you have a government. Let's take like the Soviet Union back in the day, any other country where there's not what we would call true law and order government, then you're handing them into a situation where, because you stole a loaf of bread, now you're going to end up in Siberia. Okay, that would be 100% Misira, and that's Asur. It's Asur, and this is even, we see this also in the Vaad Arba Ah'Aratzot and the Takanot. Where has this been abused? So I think some of you know that I have spent many years involved in the topic, sometimes more frequently than others, on the topic of child sex abuse, on other nefarious things that our fellow Jews seem to like to do. And within certain communities, the idea of handing over a perpetrator to the authorities is looked at as Mesira. You're handing them over, it's against the halacha, you're not allowed to do it, it's a horrible thing. Well, my answer to that type of a community is twofold. Number one, we're talking Mesira means you're not Amaretz D'Oraisa, you don't know what you're talking about. But Mesira does not apply when you have a set of law and order where there's a process of due process. Number two, that any child that's injured after the fact that you know something and you didn't do something and you protected them, every children, as far as I'm personally concerned, you are the abuser from this point on, because you enable it to continue to happen. You yourself should be arrested and thrown in jail if you knew and didn't say anything. I would be more than happy in any case to testify publicly in a court of law against anyone who tries to protect child abusers. That's my own personal belief. But the word Mesira, used way, way too broadly, is when it is used almost always nowadays, it's being used to protect somebody who's doing something nefarious. And it's terrible. It's a travesty of everything we believe in as Jews. Okay, now I will get off my soapbox and move on. There was an interesting takana they made that had to do with marriage and dowries. Nowadays, we know that when a person gets married, generally speaking, there are two parts of the ceremony. There's the part where the Harayat Mikudeshetli, be thou betrothed to me according to the laws of Moses, etc. The second half of the ceremony is the Sheva Brachot. They're usually the two parts are usually separated by the reading Ketubah, rabbi can say a few words, a family member may say something, or as sometimes happens, rabbis think that people come to the weddings to hear them speak and talk for 45 minutes. And yes, it has happened, but never, God forbid, by me. But they're separated into two parts, the Kiddushin and the Nisuin. Okay, historically, until not much more than maybe 150, 200 years ago, and I might even be overstating that, that wasn't the way it was done. The couple would get what we would call nowadays engaged, halachically engaged, which means the man would say in front of witnesses, Harayat Mikudeshetli, you are be betrothed to me, and give the ring. At that point, they are both almost married. What does it mean almost? They're not yet allowed to live together as husband and wife, because they didn't have Sheva Brachot, but they are now committed to the point that if for some reason they break up, she needs a get. She needs a divorce. Why? And what do they do then? So they waited a year to get married. What was the purpose of waiting a year? So the purpose was to enable the woman to be able for her family to provide for her a dowry to bring to the wedding or to the marriage, and for the man just to make sure he made money to have a parnassah in order to be able to support his wife and his family to be Bezrat Hashem. That's the general idea why it was split. What did they do in the Council of Four Lands? They made a couple of decrees that exist to this day in other communities. Not the exact same thing, but the same concept exists in certain communities. I know in New York. I don't know in other places. And that is, number one, setting a limit on the amount that can be spent on a wedding. And the other one was setting an amount on the size of a dowry. What does that mean? That means if for some reason you live in a community, you live in Katowice in Poland, which I don't know if it existed by that name at that point in history, and Shmerel is going to marry off his daughter, and he's a very wealthy man. He gives a 1 million zloty dowry for his daughter to the son-in-law. And then now the neighbor, he's a poor schlub, and he doesn't have that kind of money, but he feels he has to have that kind of a dowry. So he goes and begs, borrows, and steals till he's able to afford to give his daughter that kind of money to go into her marriage with. I know that sounds very foreign, and it would never happen in communities nowadays where people try to keep up with, as my Rebbe used to say, with the Jonesteins. Yeah, of course, it happens all the time. The neighbor spent this much on a bar mitzvah, or this much on a wedding, or this much on a car, or this much on a vacation. How much they're spending, what they're doing. Everyone has to know everyone's business, and they have to do better than that. They have to spend more, even if it means they're going to be up to their eyeballs in hock for the rest of their lives. And I'm saying this because the things that are being dealt with today are the same reasons that these communities had this imposed upon them by the Vaad Arba Ah'Aratzot to protect them, to help them. They limited the amount of the size of the dowry. How much it was, I don't know. You'd have to look at the Pinkasim. And the amount that the expenses could be for wedding. And they shouldn't, therefore, people shouldn't come into excessive pressure, financial pressure. There are communities that have made takanot of the amount of people you're allowed to have. By the way, there's Hasidic communities, I know this is for sure in some Hasidic communities, the amount of people you're allowed to invite to the wedding. Other communities, it is the amount of your money you're allowed to spend on a wedding. There are all kinds of interesting things, which the same spirit of what they were doing, the Vaad Arba Ah'Aratzot, are being done still to this very day. The impact, of course, again, was it promoted the sense of stability, economic stability. It reduced the inequality of socially, and so on. So, that sounds like socialism. Well, in a sense, it is, but it's not the socialism with a capital S, which I'm not a socialist. And the last one has to do with education and religious institutions. The purpose of the takana, which we'll see in a minute what it was to ensure the sustainability of Jewish learning and religious practice. That was its goal. But what was it they did? The council mandated that all communities needed to support their local yeshivot, shuls, and their communal religious leaders, whether it's the shochet, the rabbi, the Av Beit Din, head of the religious council. It also established guidelines, and I mentioned this briefly when we first started talking about last week about the Vaad Arba Ah'Aratzot. It also established guidelines for who would be considered qualified as rabbi and who would be qualified as a teacher, because their goal was to ensure high standards, both in terms of religious education and the religious instruction and teaching within the confines of a shul, which is fantastic. I mean, it's really, really fantastic. There is something like that nowadays. I'll tell you that when a person now gets smicha, they get the title rabbi, and they go to look for a position, there are all kinds of protocols now, mostly determined by Yeshiva University, where if you have passed their course of instruction or similar, then you have been considered a person who has gone through what's considered a what's the word? The guidelines of what would make an appropriate education for a shul rabbi. Very often, when a rabbi applies for a position, they would always, not very often, always they want to know where is his smicha from, who is the institution, because if it's Joe's smicha and garage, it's going to be a little problem. But if it's going to be something, no, we went to YU, we went to college in Chicago, like I did, wherever, other yeshivot, or gets a private smicha from a gadol. Again, it makes a difference to know. There are two basic kinds of smicha. Smicha literally means resting the hands, because in the time, let's say, of the Torah, we know that Moshe Rabbeinu put his hands on Yehoshua's head and gave him smicha, and then only in the land of Israel, until a certain point in history, was smicha given. Bavel it was not. That's why you'll see Tanaim, the rabbis at the time of the Mishnah, some name were titled Rabbi, and others was just Rav. It was Rabbi. He was ordained in Israel. If it was Rav, then it meant he lived in Bavel and didn't have the official title rabbi, even though they were still greater than anybody who might be alive today. In any case, so it established these guidelines. There are two types, again, speaking very broadly, two types of smicha. when a Rav gets a title rabbi, where he has the right then to be a rabbi of a shul or other institution that needs the title of a rabbi. It's called Yoreh Yoreh, based on the pasuk Mi Yoreh Deya, who will teach knowledge. So it's called Yoreh Yoreh. That's one of the four sections of Shulchan Aruch, which we talked about already a few weeks back. This is how this all connects. Yoreh Deya, which is the section that has to do with kosher and non-kosher mixtures, meat, milk mixtures, hilchot nidan, other things. When a rabbi learns, he also should have learned hilchot Shabbat and should have learned many other things. That's one. The other is yadin yadin. Yadin yadin means he shall judge, he shall judge. And that gives the person the right to sit on the Beit Din, to be a judge, a dayan. I started many, many years ago to start learning privately with my Rebbe, Rabbi Gedaliah Schwartz. That's how he gave me a curriculum, and he was going to give me tests and all. But I stopped. I didn't seemingly have the time. I didn't properly say I didn't make the time for it properly. But the difference between the two is that a person who goes to learn to be a rabbi, let's say, of a shul, to get smicha, he's learning more what's called iser v'heter, like what's allowed to do, what's not allowed to do. A dayan, getting yadin yadin, allows a person to sit in a beit din where, say, two people have an argument about, he built his, he stole money from me in a business deal or a real estate issue or all kinds of things like that, to give a psak halacha, a decision of halacha, where the litigants must abide by it. That is only done with a dayan. The obvious impact of this kind of a takana, where they made guidelines for who could be a teacher, who could be a rabbi, it ensured the transmission of Torah in the proper way. Now, having said that, we will eventually come to the time period of the Haskalah in the 1800s. We'll learn about some names that you may know of by their book, the Chatam Sofer, the Chasam Sofer, and Sham Hirsch, very much the poster child, sorry to use the word, but for being against the Haskalah movement and the original background to the concept, which became Yeshiva University of Torah Mada, all kinds of fun stuff coming up. But the fact is, at this time, this was the best way to ensure proper transmission of Torah, because not only did it mean that you are getting the qualified people, hopefully, to fill these positions, but you also understood then that the people that were learning would be able to then transmit to the next generation properly, because they were learning properly. The efforts of the council had to balance also the communal needs and the individual needs, ethics and financial and all kinds of things. So it's truly an amazing thing that they were able to accomplish so much in all these years. And again, there is a book. Let me see if I actually have, let me get it here on the screen, find it. Let me cut and paste this, copy. Just give me 1 second. Paste. If I find it real fast. Yeah. So let me share this. Share. Okay. This, wait till that goes away. This is the one, like a index, not index, like a table of contents. One volume. This came out in 1945. It comes from manuscripts, from Polish Jewry, their letters, historical letters, handwritten stuff, all kinds of Jewish background, various communal information from Poland. And it talks about Vaad Arba Ah'Aratzot, Mosad Shofet HaMechokek Shel Yehudei Polin. It says 200 years, thought it was longer than that. Maybe this book only covers a couple hundred years. I thought it was more. Anyways, maybe I'm wrong. I remember remembering. In any case, You can't get the book online, but you can see at least the table of contents. It goes by year. The year not tough, just Shin Mem Aleph. This is 400 years ago. Shin Mem Aleph, Shimon Gimel, Shin Mem Zayin. What did they do? They had an annual. I talked about this last time. Yerid, which was we would call today a kenes or a conference. And this is we're going to see how the Rama fits in here in just a minute. And at this conference, they would have all these discussions and make their takanot and litigate various cases. When they were done, the scribes would write all this stuff up, and they would publish them in some form of a pinkas, in some form of a notebook. And then over time, they would be compiled and would have this. These are all the different years in which they had and all the different sections they had that has to do with the Vaad Arba Ah'Aratzot. Okay, so now let's come back here, close this back up. Okay. What did Rama have to do with any of this? What was his involvement? So interestingly enough, we'll see that in a second. The Rama never was officially trained in grammar, in Hebrew grammar. He never studied Hebrew grammar. Now, he was a genius, so he was able to figure out a lot of stuff. But unlike Ibn Ezra and other people whom we've talked about, especially in the Golden Age of Spain, where we have many, many grammarians, he didn't really study grammar properly necessarily, or I say properly, officially. But nevertheless, the way he wrote, both in his responsa and then eventually in the Shulchan Aruch, was a very high flowery level, especially his responsa, where you really had to understand what he was saying to understand more than just the answer he was giving. We see this with Rav Kook, by the way, also. Now, Rav Kook was a genius at Hebrew in every area, Kabbalah. When he writes halacha, he writes straightforward, normal Hebrew, and it's understandable when he writes his perush on the Sidur, again. But when he writes anything beyond that, all the philosophy, it's very high Hebrew. It's very the language is very not just high, flowery, and one of those where a sentence can have a meaning that you have to discuss for 20 minutes. That was in a sense when Moshe Isserles Rama wrote some of his responses, halachic shelot and shuvot. That was one of the things that would be stick out for him was the way he wrote. It still was understandable. It wasn't philosophical like Rav Kook did eventually. But he also was very prominent as one of these Gedoli, one of the great people of his time. He was very prominent in the Council of the Four Lands. It's not like there's a Council of Four Lands and there was him. Remember, he's in Poland, he's in Krakow, and he's the chief rabbi of Krakow. He has thousands of people who are followers of him. It was established in his time. And he would, there would be a quarrel, a fight between rabbis, for example. I know it's hard to believe rabbis would have disagreements. He actually would say, we are not going to decide on what's going to happen at this point. And he has many truvot where he writes, we're going to read, I'm just going to read you one line I'm not even putting on the screen. Va'al yirid Lublin karov yirdu ladin beyachad. He said, we're going to wait until the upcoming conference in Lublin of the Vaad Arba Ah'Aratzot, and then together we will go and we will adjudicate this case. So he was very involved in the Vaad Arba Ah'Aratzot. He was, by the way, he was also, not only was he recognized as somebody who wrote Shelot and Shuvot, not only was he recognized as someone who wrote the Mapa, or his glosses on the Shulchan Aruch, but he also was authority in Kabbalah, philosophy, and secular sciences. You know, we take a look at somebody like, for example, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein Zatzal, Rosh Hashiva in the Gush for many years, who I only heard speak once near the end of his life. Here was a man, and also we have right here in our own neighborhood, we had Rabbi Novitzch Zatzal, You're talking people who could quote Shakespeare like they could quote Bereshit. They knew mechanical engineering and sciences and philosophy. Is like to them it was like interchangeable as far as because you needed certain things to be able to answer certain types of questions. Imagine a rabbi has absolutely no knowledge of how electricity works, and they ask him, "Am I allowed to go on a Shabbat elevator? Can I use one?" Well, if you don't know the first thing about electricity or mechanical engineering and all kinds of other stuff, what are you going to do? How are you supposed to answer that? So if you take a look, for example, in Rav Rabinovич's writings, you will find that he has drawings and all kinds of amazing things that's like has to do with electricity. He had a master's or a doctorate, all kinds of degrees in so many areas. And that was the Rama also. He understood, he learned philosophy. We talked about this whole dispute that he had about is it allowed to, not allowed? He said yes. When it comes to philosophy, we talked about that last time. He knew about secular sciences. There are some stories that are told about him over the years as well. I'm not going to get into them, but Polish Jewry to this very day, and many people who've go to Poland, like I have been, will go to his kever, go to his burial place in Krakow. I showed you the picture last week, and go to his shul, the Rama shul. We can divide his writing into two main sections, two main branches. Number one was halacha, and that had to do with whether it's the Shulchan Aruch that he added to, or it had to do with Shelot and Shuvot. People asked him questions, like we saw the Gaonic period, right? We saw that for a number of centuries that was the way that halacha started, the base of halacha starts to grow. These back and forth letters to the Gaonim. So he wrote a lot, and that's one section. The other is philosophical, Kabbalistic, scientific. He did a lot of writing, but obviously his main reputation is not in philosophy or Kabbalah or science. It has to do with his reputation as a halachicist, his idea of that his need to vindicate the Ashkenazi customs. So remember, when Rabbi Yosef Karo, and by the way, they got along very well. I still say that one of the greatest things that the Rama did was he put his notes and added it to what was already written by the Rabbi Yosef Karo, as opposed to coming out with his own book, because then we would have two Shulchan Aruch, and that would not be good. We have two mixed into one. We have one volume called the Shulchan Aruch, and it's for Ashkenazim, it's for Saradim, Teimanim, and others. There's differences in certain minhagim, but in general, when Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote it, it was the perspective of the Sfaradi world, and therefore the customs of the Sfaradim and the halakha of the Sfaradim. Along comes Rabbi Yosef Karo, Rabbi Moshe Yisraelis, the Rama. He says, look, it's a great, fantastic sefer, but there are certain things that you guys do differently than we do. And I need to point that out to my community, the world of Ashkenaz. By the way, historically, Ashkenaz meant Germany, but it's meant to be like the Eastern European world. So like Rabbi Yosef Karo, he also wrote a commentary. Remember, Rabbi Yosef Karo originally wrote his commentary on the Torah, and a very, very large commentary, and he condensed it down to the Shulchan Aruch. So too, the Rama wrote a commentary also from the Ashkenazi perspective, also on the Torah. It was called Darkei Moshe. And in the Darkei Moshe, he actually criticizes the Beit Yosef, i.e. Rabbi Yosef Karo, heavily about some of the things he wrote, saying that that's not right, it's wrong, it's not how we act, it's not what we're supposed to do. What you will find over time, and I didn't mention this when we talked about the Rambam, but you will find some of the ways that these rabbis interacted in their words between one and another was, today they would sound like they were having a horrific fight, but back then, the way, I'll give you an example in a second, was said out of it was sometimes comical and said completely out of love. There was one, I don't remember where I saw it, but I saw it with my own eyes. I just wish I could find it. I could probably search for it. One of the commentaries on the Rambam is known as the Ravad or the Ravid. And there's something called the Hasagot HaRavad or the Hasagos HaRavid, where he writes commentary on the Rambam. He says the Rambam's wrong about this, or he contradicts himself, all kinds of interesting stuff. One time he wrote, the Rambam is wrong about this, And chaval al hadio shenechtav bo. What a waste of ink that the Rambam had to waste ink writing those words. Now, if that were to be written today, imagine somebody, top tier rabbi today, would say that when Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, Rabbi Yaakov Kanievsky wrote this tshuva, that what a waste of ink. And the world will come crashing down. How dare you say something like that about a gadol? But it was said out of love. It was sounded comical, but it was said out of love. So too, this was the relationship between Rabbi Yosef Karo and the Rama. But what was really critical for the Rama was making sure not just the halachot, where there was a difference, but the minhag. Most of what the Rama writes in the Shulchan Aruch is actually about minhagim. Now, you might be thinking like minhagim, well, that means like what? So I'm not allowed to do X, or I wait 6 hours or 3 hours or 1 hour, those kind of minhagim. So that's why I want to talk about, hopefully next week, if I get my act together, talk about minhagim, because it's a critical difference, not just between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, because I'm not really going to discuss that too much, but within families, within communities, where there are different minhagim. I'll give you an example that's not a minhag. It's like what are called, I guess, mores or social niceties. If you go to shul, go to a wedding, United States, men most of the time will show up, jacket and tie. Sometimes it's a tuxedo, women in dresses, go to shul on Shabbat. Again, jacket and tie for the most part, not across the board. But what you'll find is when you go to weddings here, or you go to shul, you'll find people showing up in all manners of dress. I remember when I first started going to weddings here, it's like, why you come in jeans and a nice white shirt? Okay, I mean, I'm used to it now, but it was just very different. So that's not a minhag. That's just a way, the social way people are acting, dressing. But there are actually areas where a minhag, and they make sometimes a very, very big difference in how a person acts, either based on the community or based on family, based on a husband and wife, based on marriage, based on Sfaradi, Ashkenazi. So because it was so important to the Rama, like I say, I think that I'll do that Bezrat Hashem next week and try to make a presentation about minhagim. So Bezrat Hashem, that'll be next week on Tuesday night, Yom Shlishi, or Yom Revi'i. In the meantime, everyone should have a wonderful day, or wonderful evening. And let's hope for some Bisarot because we really, really need them.